Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to TLC Academy. This is Alan Susi with TLC Home Care, and I'm pleased to have with me today Sharon McCarthy, one of our caregivers. Sharon's brought in some information today about the problem of the stigma of mental illness in our society and what we can do to get rid of that stigma. So hopefully at the end of Sharon's presentation, we all will be better educated about what that stigma is and how we can do something to get rid of it.
Hopefully. Thank you. What is stigma and why is it a problem? Stigma is when someone, or even yourself, views a person in a negative way just because they have a mental health condition. Some people describe stigma as a feeling of shame or judgment from someone else. Stigma can even come from an internal place, confusing feeling bad with being bad. Navigating life with a mental health condition can be tough. The isolation, blame, and secrecy that are often encouraged by stigma can create huge challenges to reaching out, getting needed support, and living well. Learning how to avoid and address stigma are important for all of us, especially when you realize its effects. People experiencing mental health conditions often face rejection, bullying, and discrimination. Excuse me. This can make their journey to recovery longer and more difficult. Mental health conditions are the leading cause of disability across the United States. The catastrophic effects of mental health stigma are enormous. Some people insist stigma around mental health is no longer an issue in our society, and mental illness no longer a taboo. While going to therapy and taking psychotropic medications is largely accepted in metropolitan cities like New York and Los Angeles, the same cannot be said for many other parts of the country, nor for many parts of the world. According to Mental Health America, 43.7 million Americans struggle with mental health conditions annually. 1 out of 5 of these individuals will not receive the treatment that they need. There are many reasons for the gap in care, but stigma and discrimination fall high on that list. Many people feel shame about seeking help. The impact of stigma is tragic because mental health challenges are actually very common. And we have good treatments. Stigma leads to discrimination in housing, employment, and education, according to Bethany Teachman, a psychology professor. Stigma still remains such a problem that the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine put out a report this year calling for a national evidence-based strategy to counter stigma. How did we get here? Society has always viewed mental illness as a sign of weakness. Despite how much we have discovered about how the brain works in the last 50 years, stigma still persists. According to Marina Olson, who works with makingitwork.org, an organization that combats stigma by educating the public about mental health and by encouraging people to talk about it, in many pockets of America, mental health is still a cultural taboo. In Psychology Today, Quentin Venny, author of Strong in the Broken Places, a memoir of addiction and redemption through wellness, said one of the greatest stigmas affecting the Black community is the belief that having a mental health disorder constitutes weakness. His hope is to break barriers and end the stigma behind seeking help. Mental health is not a race, religion, or gender issue. It is a humanity issue. Despite the myth that people with a mental health issue are more likely to be violent, research shows the opposite is true, that those with severe mental illnesses are over 10 times more likely to be the victims of violence than the general population. You probably know someone with a mental health issue and do not even realize it. Because many people with mental health problems are highly active and productive members of our communities. People suffering from serious mental illness are at a 10 times higher risk of being incarcerated versus being committed to a psychiatric hospital for treatment, according to the Greenberger Center for Social and Criminal Justice. That's very sad. Stigma, ignorance, and the refusal to put mental illness on par with physical illness is one of the reasons our society has criminalized a disease that is a brain disorder. The alternative is to aim for treatment, not punishment. Incarceration is often not the answer. This would save lives, taxpayer funds, and make communities safer. A parent's worst nightmare. Former Boston Red Sox pitcher John Troutwing and his wife Susie are the founders of the Will to Live Foundation, a nonprofit whose mission is to spread awareness around teen suicide and the stigma of mental health. They founded the organization after losing their 15-year-old son Will to suicide. They teach kids that it's okay not to be okay, says Troutwing. I never said that to my son when he was alive because I did not realize it. According to Troutwing, the best way to normalize mental illness is to talk about it. The general public is uneducated about mental illness, that it is a treatable, curable, common, and okay. Before my son died, no one ever talked to me about mental illness, and I truly wish they had. Chris Hickey, is a mental health advocate and the mother of a young adult son living with childhood onset schizophrenia. Like many parents of children with severe mental illness, Hickey often faces stigmatization. She suggests that to help reduce the stigma, we stop using slang and humor around illness. She also suggests reaching out to neighbors and friends who may be struggling, to be aware of how we speak and our actions, our body language. While communities rally around families who have a loved one with cancer or other physical illness, families with a loved one in psychiatric treatment are often met with avoidance, isolation, and shame. This makes it much harder to recover. Pick up the phone and ask, how can you help? What can I do? By keeping the conversation going, by continuing to share stories, and thus normalizing mental health issues, perhaps more and more individuals will be inspired to share their stories. Eventually, this could lead to slow deterioration of any remnants of shame that may remain in the minds of those who struggle with mental health conditions, as well as in the minds of those around them, including those at the highest levels in our nation, impacting legislation and healthcare. It is an odd paradox, wrote actress and mental illness destigmatization advocate Glenn Close, that a society which can now speak openly and unabashedly about topics that were once unspeakable still remains largely silent when it comes to mental illness. The paradox is indeed odd, but it is also more than that. It is dangerous. Stigma can make people feel somehow less than, damaged, or abnormal because of the diagnosis of mental illness, often leading to negative consequences. People may avoid getting life-saving treatment, refrain from reaching out to offer support to others in similar situations, or remain silent instead of advocating for policy and structural changes that could benefit everyone. It's past time for stigma in our society to be acknowledged, examined, and disposed of. It's simply been around for far too long and hurt too many people. The good news is these are real steps that can be taken on the path to removing stigma. 5 ways to remove stigma associated with mental health. Removing the negative stigma with mental health will save lives. This is verified and suggested in an article by Psychology Today. 1. Remember that language matters. It's worth changing how we speak and the terms that we use. Advocates suggest putting the focus on the person and not the diagnosis. Try to avoid the term patient. The word patient is Latin and means one who suffers, which can have a negative connotation that risks dehumanizing the person. Every person is more than a label or diagnosis. So, for example, instead of referring to someone as schizophrenic, rephrase to simply state that the person has schizophrenia. 2. Be an advocate, either personally or for the ADA, which is the American Disabilities Act, for accommodations in schools and workplace, so that people can capitalize on their strengths rather than being excluded because of a disability. An inclusive environment can decrease the stigma and move towards focusing on positive attributes and abilities. 3. Help work to integrate mental health into primary settings through healthcare and mental health working collaboratively, primary doctors and therapists working together collectively, not separate. Physical, emotional, spiritual are all inclusive in our wholeness and our well-being. 4. Be someone who helps to start the conversation about stigma. Self-stigma is a concept that is too infrequently mentioned in mental health treatment circles. The term refers to the internalization of public stigma, whereby a person applies negative beliefs to his or her own self-concept. It is common and harmful. Discard the erroneous view of mental health and illness. People experience a range of normal reactions to life stressors, and unfortunately, we tend to label conditions as a disease instead of seeing things from a different viewpoint. A true recovery orientation views mental health as a spectrum, not an all or nothing state of being. Everyone is working on something. This is life. It will always be true that improving our physical and mental health is a marathon, not a sprint. If we can figure out the things that make it easier for us to attend to our mental health, including destigmatization of mental illness of all kinds, then it is important that we pursue them as fully and as present as we can.